Hello, everybody. My name's Lucas Grindley, as he said. And for what I'm about to share with you, I'll be drawing on my work, about 20 years in journalism so far. And I'll be drawing on a lot about expertise from other people who care about narrative change. What I've noticed over these 20 years is that there are stories all around us, and that maybe we don't get to notice them because they're so common or they're so ubiquitous, and they are deciding what gets done. But before I get into that, a little bit about Next City. We are a nonprofit news organization, so we are mission-driven, not profit-driven. We are reporting only about solutions, as Nico said, and we report only about solutions that are making life in cities more equitable and more just. And this year we're celebrating actually an important milestone. It's our 20-year anniversary. It's our birthday. We weren't founded, thank you. We weren't founded by journalists, actually, though we're run today by journalists. Instead, it was founded by a group of college students who thought that the story about cities that you hear was only about their problems, right? And they thought that that was wrong because there's so many people out there working on solutions and that there were so many solutions available. And they wanted to change the narrative about cities. You could say they were founding Next City to work on narrative change. I am Next City's executive director, and I host our podcast. So you can find us right now, by the way, by looking on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts if you want to subscribe, little plug. We've produced probably over 50 episodes so far. I've probably done more than 100 interviews for the podcast, and I approach each episode, at least in my mind, with this question about what is the dominant narrative at play in the story that we're highlighting, and is this solution that we're highlighting part of a counter-narrative that's important? Dominant narratives are important. Counter-narratives are also important. So I'm going to share with you some of what I've learned after probably 5,000 hours of interviews so far. I actually ask people all the time whether there are narratives that are helping or hindering their work getting done. And one that comes up all the time we're going to talk a lot about today. And I realized when I was getting ready for this presentation, I could probably only talk about one narrative, really. So we're going to really focus in on this one narrative that comes up all the time. And that one narrative is a personal responsibility narrative, usually as a hindrance. So we're a show that's focused on solutions. So we did an episode about guaranteed income programs. There are pilots, dozens of them all around the country right now. The longest running guaranteed income program in the whole country is in Jackson, Mississippi, and it's called the Magnolia Mothers Trust. It was designed by Black mothers for other Black mothers. Each mom in the program receives $1,000 every month for 12 months, no strings attached. So that means that there are no rules about whether you can buy a soda or a snack or a whole meal or whatever it is you want, because that's important because there's a lot of suspicion, actually, about what happens if you give a poor Black mom money. What will she spend it on? And we're going to talk about where that suspicion comes from, hinted as a narrative. But the results are unequivocal about guaranteed income programs, right? So collectively, the moms in Magnolia Mothers Trust paid off $10,000 in predatory debt. The percentage of mothers who said that they could pay all their bills on time increased from 27% to 83%. And the percentage of moms who had money saved for emergencies went from 40% to 88%, so double. So their financial health changed dramatically. Guaranteed income programs are proven to reduce poverty. You can look at any pilot program, and that's what you're going to find. That's what they're starting to show. People are tracking this. You could look at the child tax credit, which some call a form of guaranteed income. And on an annual basis, according to the U.S. Census, child poverty fell to its lowest level on record in 2021, 5.2%, which was a 44% reduction in child poverty. Don't we want to reduce poverty or end poverty, eliminate it? Because if we do, then why wouldn't there be actual programs and not just pilot programs, right? So for the Next City podcast, I spoke with the person who runs this program in Jackson, Mississippi. Her name is Aisha Nyandoro, and her organization is called Springboard to Opportunities. She has to raise the money for her guaranteed income program from foundations and other people. It's not a state program. And she says all the time, poverty is a policy choice, not a personal choice. What does she mean by that? She means we blame people who are poor for being poor. and this is what she said. We see individuals leaning into the narrative of it being a personal failing, and it's just the stories we tell ourselves. I feel that we tell ourselves these stories about poverty because it allows us to absolve ourselves of any guilt. We make it feel as if it's something that we don't have control over, and the reality is we do. By looking at it as a personal failing, it absolves us of feeling as if it's a bigger ecosystem that we can be involved in and be perpetuating. And she is right. You've heard in the United States this idea that we should be able to pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, right? Just pull yourself up. What's wrong with you? Can't you do it? You just pull yourself up. Work harder. That's what the old story goes, the old pull yourself up by your bootstrap story goes. So narratives are picking our solutions for us. Narratives like this one about pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, another name for this slide could be wrong narrative equals wrong fix. The notion that we can just fix our own poverty, we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and absolves us of thinking that there is a systemic solution that is available to us. If it's a person's problem, then all the system has to do is give you a chance to work hard. All the system has to do is give you opportunities to work, right? So our political dialogue in this country stems from this bootstraps view. It goes way, 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 way back. But President Ronald Reagan was pretty famous for talking a lot about personal responsibility. If you search Ronald Reagan personal responsibility, you can get a lot of results. And then it really took off in the early 90s, actually, with this guy, the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and his proposed contract with America, which was all about personal responsibility. They said the solution to every problem was empowering people with the opportunity to determine their own futures. Republicans at the time said people with poor character, they didn't value family, and they didn't value work, and they were taking advantage of a broken big government system. There's a thing in narrative storytelling where you have to come up with a main character, and then that main character has to have something that they're going after, and the things that are stopping the main character from achieving them or helping them achieve them is what creates tension. It creates a really good story. So they created this term welfare queens, which you've probably heard, and then they created this help, which was the welfare state, and the government was the real problem here. It was an enabler of all these people who should just work harder and pull themselves out of poverty. But I'm not making a political statement about this. This, I promise, this was actually an effective narrative from the whole country, and it's part of just who we are as Americans. And it was actually President Clinton, known as the great communicator, who invented welfare to work. You can see it behind him in that big slogan behind him. It's actually almost amazing to me to hear someone imply that black moms are lazy in some way. I feel like I have to say that that's weird, because if you talk to Aisha Nyandoro, she says, you know, the black moms that I'm working with are all working 2 jobs. They're doing everything that they can to try to make ends meet. So I feel like I have to call that out. But a lot of times I'm talking with progressive groups of people who don't believe me when I say, they're more likely to believe that Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich were part of this narrative and not that the Democrats are part of the narrative. So if you don't believe me, we're going to play a quick video to show you what was going on at the time. This is a 1992 campaign video.
For so long, government has failed us, and one of its worst failures has been welfare. I have a plan to end welfare as we know it, to break the cycle of welfare dependency. We'll provide education, job training, and child care, but then those who are able must go to work, either in the private sector or in public service. I know it can work. In my state, we've moved 17,000 people from welfare rolls to payrolls. It's time to make welfare what it should be, a second chance, not a way of life.
It's time to make welfare what it should be, a second chance, not a way of life. A second chance, because we believe in second chances. He didn't even have to make an argument that people deserve second chances. That's just a given in his case here. So remember that, because we're going to come back to that later. So some of you recall Clinton's welfare reform was passed with Republican support, and the government created block grant programs, and the states could spend the welfare money basically however they chose, and that's what exists in Mississippi today, where Aisha Nyandoro and Magnolia Mothers Trust is, and that's part of what they say is the reason they can't get funding for the guaranteed income program to be permanent. But this narrative of personal responsibility is in a lot of things, actually. So personal responsibility is just in the air. And it was put there deliberately, right? This is a photo of Dignity Village, which is actually here in Portland. In a lot of places, cities right now are struggling with encampments. People are angry about that, right? Well, 20 years ago, there was an encampment here in Portland, and the city tried to ban outdoor camping. And very long story short, people protested that, and they created a permanent village that is actually run by the unhoused people who live there. And it's been going on for 20 years now. They make the rules, and so they've helped many people gain temporary housing that leads to permanent housing. For the podcast about this solution, I spoke with Lisa Larson, who is the elected chair of Dignity Village. They're a democratically run group of people. And I asked her why, if they're so successful, there aren't more places like Dignity Village right now. And she said, well, a lot of times people feel that, the unhoused people, how did they become unhoused? Because they don't have enough smarts to run a company. That's what she says we think. And it's probably true, we do think that. We may not have the prior knowledge, but we sure can learn, she says. We're just people trying to survive. And she had to unlearn this about people experiencing homelessness as a homeless person. She had to unlearn this dominant narrative about personal responsibility and about why people are homeless. And during the podcast interview, she said that when she first heard about Dignity Village back those 20 years ago, she saw it on the news and the headlines, and she remembers turning to her kids and saying, why can't those homeless people get off their butts and do something? So now she knows we're just people trying to survive, and she says, people are just one paycheck away. They don't recognize that thin line between them and becoming unhoused. So narratives are dictating which solutions we decide will work. If people experiencing homelessness are there on the street because it's their own fault, then how can the city trust them to run a tiny home village where they govern themselves? They can't do that, right? So it doesn't happen. Personal responsibility is an insidious narrative. It comes up in welfare, it comes up in homelessness, it comes up even in racism. So for the podcast, I interviewed the chancellor of UNC Greensboro, and so I'm getting ready for the interview, and I come across this work that he was doing for the Frameworks Institute and their researchers. I'm preparing for the interview, and I come across this study where they tested different ways of talking about racism with white people. And here's one of the key takeaways from what they found. The public understands racism as being embedded in individuals and resulting in individual acts. If the issue is about individuals and their behavior, then there is no role for collective action in solving the problem, other than outlawing prejudicial acts, which the public believes to have already been accomplished. In other words, if people are racist, then there's really no solution for that, right? I mean, people are just racist. And this is why nothing changes, according to Frameworks, because we think nothing can change. You have to go and talk to each racist person and change their mind. That would take a long time. So I'll stop there on making the point that narratives are dictating our solutions. It's almost like just a logical thing that happens, right? But let's talk about the second thing that you need to know about narratives. Narratives tell us about how we feel about new ideas before we've even heard the idea. Narratives to me are the information you get before you get any information at all. They tell us how to think about the information we're about to receive, and that's why you can't ignore the narrative. If you want what you're producing, if it's some research or a policy idea, whatever it might be, you have to know what the narrative is that's going on. And you have to realize the information you're providing to people is secondary to the narrative. Literally, it is the second thing that your audience will hear about your work. So let's think about it this way. One thing you don't know about me is in my spare time, I also write little instrumental music that I hope will become stock music one day. No one has heard this music except my husband and my daughters and my dog, who's heard it a lot. And I played it once for my dad. I was playing like a scary sort of film music sound, right? And he said that he wasn't sure if he'd be able to sleep at night, which I think was a compliment. Anyway, my point is you can hear the music in the movie, right? And you just know something bad is about to happen. You're basing it based on like the million times you've heard these sort of sounds before. You know that something bad is about to happen. And I don't know how much time you spend on TikTok, but one of the trends that I love is when people take famous movie scenes and they swap the music out and they swap out the music that's playing in the background. So we're going to watch one right now. It's from Star Wars. So the caption on that clip is, music really makes a difference. And hopefully you're starting to see where I'm going with this, which is that narratives are like the music, right? They tell us about the scene that we're watching. The scene, the information can be exactly the same, but the music changes how you interpret it. So the henchman looks to the doorway, and the puff of smoke reveals a figure, and it's Darth Vader, and the henchman gulps, and in one set of music, he's terrified, and the other set of music, it's his soulmate, he's found him. And just like in the actual movies, the characters, they don't hear the music, and that's why you can use existing narratives. One of the people I interviewed on the podcast is Trevor Smith from Liberation Ventures, which is a great organization that you should look up, and I have no time to talk about right now. And he is their he's their director of narrative change. And he told me narrative change requires knowing what narratives you're up against and putting narratives out there that counter those stories. And you have to ask yourself, how can we get our strategies, our issues, and our organizing into the mainstream media by weaving our narrative with an existing narrative? And I should really just change this slide to say you should use existing narratives, not you can use existing narratives. Here is one example of that. In Atlanta, 2 women founded an organization to support people returning from prison. It's called Barred Business. And they just won a vote in the Atlanta City Council to designate formerly incarcerated people as a protected class. So now they can't be discriminated against, at least not legally. I mean, they have to enforce it. There's lots to go on from that point, but it's a big step forward. And I don't have the time to tell you the whole story, but you'll have to listen to the podcast episode. But what I can tell you is that these women were cellmates. And like many people who come home from prison, they discovered that prison isn't really over when you leave prison. It's not really ever over. They could be barred from housing. They could be asked about their record in job interviews and then lose those jobs. And the woman that you see in this picture here is Bridget Simpson, who said she felt like after returning home from prison, it shouldn't be too late for her to become a mom. She had lost a lot of time, but she still wanted to be a mom. And she wanted to get services, medical services that would help her to do that. But they told her that she did not qualify. She did not qualify to be a mother because she had been in prison. People who return from prison say that they've taken responsibility for their mistakes and that they feel like we punish them forever. And they don't get the second chance that Bill Clinton was talking about in that campaign commercial. Remember, that was actually the title of the campaign commercial, was Second Chances, because people like those. So when these women showed all the ways, and there are a lot of them, there's over 100 different ways, that they're not being given a second chance, it had an eye-opening effect in Atlanta, and they passed that ordinance unanimously. Every member on the city council voted to approve it. So they were able to use an existing narrative, but they're also pushing a new counter-narrative. So, doubly great here. So this is what she told me. We would like to invite people into a narrative that we don't throw anybody away, right? We want to invite you into a transformative process where we can actually principally struggle together. So the narrative is really about us. And what are we doing? It's not about personal responsibility. It's about our responsibility. And I'm going to give you one more example, and this one comes from transportation, since we're at a transportation conference. Free transit is in lots of places now, or it has been for a long time, actually, in a lot of places. This is the 28 bus in Boston, which is now fare-free. It's an experiment, and one day they'd like to make all of public transit free, but this is a pilot program. Early results are in. People overwhelmingly perceive free bus service to be better bus service. It's actually, in this case, it's not faster. It's not faster, but people believe, they don't have all the stress of getting on and off the bus. There's not all that to worry about, that it is actually going faster when it's actually just easier. So it's a pilot program that is gaining public support, and I interviewed the chief of streets in Boston because probably the most compelling thing about this program is how they talk about the program. So here's what he said. He said, "We think there's real value in reconceptualizing public transit, more like how we think about our roads. They're free Anyone can drive on them. They're just available. And yet we treat transit like a thing that has to be purchased in the marketplace in a competitive basis with other modes. What he's really saying there is what he's saying is really getting someplace isn't just your responsibility as a person, figure it out. Now what we say is public transit is a public good. And if you've been following this story, then you know probably that Boston's Mayor Wu had been a city councilor, and she was known as an advocate for fare-free buses. And by the time she was running for mayor, as the field whittled down, basically all final 5 or 6 candidates were in favor of some level of fare elimination. And that's because of this kind of reframing where it isn't about the rider, it's about us and the people who run the systems. We have to change if this is the narrative. We have to take responsibility. Let's think back on this a little bit. So first of all, narratives exist. There are other ones we haven't talked about, lots of them actually, but one is like corporate purpose. Are we here to serve our shareholders in the Milton Friedman way of viewing the world? Or, corporate purpose versus community purpose. Whichever narrative we buy into can logically lead us to solutions, as we've said, but here is the good news. Even if the frame shifts to systemic problems rather than individuals, solutions need to be prominent so that people understand that effective solutions to these problems exist. In other words, knowing there's a solution at the system level inherently takes us out of the personal responsibility narrative. It just snaps you out of it. So you need to make sure people hear about solutions, that they exist. Too often, public support for policies is undermined by the assumption that nothing can be done, that no solutions exist, which is actually probably the biggest narrative out there, and it's the one that we at Next City do the most to combat. People believe nothing changes, when in fact, change is possible. And I'll do one better than that. Change is not only possible, change is happening. And that's why, the plug for the magazine. This is filled with actual solutions that are happening. I apologize that this is the only narrative that I could really get into with enough time today to underscore. I just want to underscore the importance of narratives. And I was thinking a lot about, could I go into what are effective counter narratives? I've got examples of bad ones. I thought about talking about who creates narratives and who perpetuates them. What are the different groups that you need to get it done and change narratives? I thought about talking about this one podcast episode we did on City Thread, where they created a program to build 335 miles of bike lanes in 5 cities in 24 months. And they did it with community engagement. And the community engagement activated the people who were most likely to agree with them so that they could get more people more involved, but also get them more attention. And otherwise the narrative gets taken over by the naysayers, right? But really, I feel like you all will leave and hopefully keep thinking about narratives, and hopefully you'll start seeing them all over the place, and you'll be able to hear the music that we can't normally hear, hopefully. I feel like if we could tap into the power of narratives, we could get a lot more done, we could change more, and we could do it more quickly. So thank you for listening.